and I have good news and bad news. The bad news is everything you've heard in the entire rest of this program and will continue to hear. The good news is it won't matter if we all die in an enormous global fireball. And here to talk about that possibility is Ryan Cooper. Ryan's been on the show before. He is national correspondent with The Week. His work has also appeared at other fine publications, including The New Republic and The Washington Post. So first of all, Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Secondly, you wrote a piece for The Week this week or the other day it was given the eye-catching headline, "You should still be terrified of World War III." Why should we still be terrified of World War III?
Well, basically just because even if it's extremely unlikely, it would be, one of the few things that could potentially threaten to extinguish the entire human race, or, failing that, like 4/5 of it. And especially including virtually everyone in the United States. If there were to somehow be a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States, that would happen. You could have nuclear winter and, a massive dose of radiation. The ozone would be mostly gone. And, most people on Earth would die. And, that's an unlikely situation, but, there's still more than enough nuclear warheads between the two powers to lead to that result. And so any sort of tension between Russia and the United States is cause for, alarm that despite the fact that obviously nobody on either side wants that to happen, we've seen it nearly happen multiple times during the Cold War as a result of, jostling for position or just the, diplomatic confusion and stuff like that. And so, it's a possibility you have to take seriously.
Yeah. And just to jump in for a second, I am actually part of that generation that grew up having to duck and cover in school to practice for nuclear attacks, which we later learned was absolutely just a mind control or propaganda ploy, because ducking and covering will not protect you from a nuclear attack, but it gave people the sense that there was something they could do. I was a small child during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember air raid drills. I got caught in a barber shop during an air raid drill when I was 10 and had to walk home through the deserted streets. It's one of the big memories of my early childhood. So, but of course, everybody thought once the Soviet Union fell, great, the Cold War is over. We don't have to worry about that kind of extinction level event anymore. But your point is tensions are escalating between the U.S. and Russia, and we could be getting there. So, and not only that, but you talk about Syria. Why is Syria a flashpoint?
Well, it's a flashpoint because we're fighting on somewhat opposite sides there. The Russians are trying to prop up Assad, and the United States has semi-decided that Assad needs to go. And so recently they shot down a Syrian fighter jet, and in retaliation, the Russians stopped using this communications line that Obama had set up to deal with disputes and handle communications and stuff, and also threatened to shoot down American planes if they're perceived as a threat. Like, it was just a big ratcheting up of tensions. And the thing about Syria is there's no sort of strategic interest there for the United States. We're not really, we're trying to achieve a bunch of mutually incompatible things, like take down Assad and ISIS and the Islamist rebel groups all at the same time. We're all fighting each other. And as compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you could say, oh, yes, having nuclear missiles on Cuba is a threat to the United States. this is a comprehensible thing that we're fighting over. Meanwhile, Trump is getting us, in a potentially shooting war with Russia over this completely nonsensical intervention that never made sense from the start and has never been pursued in any sort of logical coherence. It's just maddening,
And what
are we doing?
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a second. And again, we're talking with Ryan Cooper of The Week. Let's talk about Syria because, yes, the notion of any nuclear weaponry in the hands of someone like Donald Trump is terrifying. But this insanely incoherent Syria policy is essentially a bipartisan policy. I mean, you had Hillary Clinton arguing for a position that I interpreted to be pretty much what Trump is doing now, which is we don't like Assad and we want to overthrow him, but at the same time, so that means kind of supporting the people that are against him, but the people who are against him are sort of terrorist or terroristy, so we also oppose them. So somehow, aren't we sort of backing both sides and fighting both sides at the same time?
That's exactly right. And this, is somewhat of a product of the Obama years, and he did not want, I think laudably, did not want to get directly involved in Syria, but he couldn't resist the tendency to do something. There's this horrible civil war happening, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people are dying. Millions of migrants are fleeing to Europe to, avoid, destitution and being killed. And, there's this very frightening terror group, ISIS, but we could never resist the sort of temptation that the American military is invincible and omnipotent and could achieve all of our goals at once. And, the thing to do, in my view, would have been either, pick what you want to do, think that it's something that is achievable, then either do it or don't do it. But we chose this middle ground that not only failed to achieve any of the objectives, but also dramatically prolonged the war. If powers that didn't have the investment and the commitment had stayed out of it, somebody would have won by now, and there wouldn't be a civil war going on anymore. Instead, now it's just like endless stalemate that looks to be, just be staying that way perhaps for years or decades.
Yeah, and it seems to me, and correct me, first of all, you summarized this very well in your piece, Ryan Cooper. You said, Russia has a clear goal, prop up the Assad regime, but avoid being drawn too far into the conflict while we're doing all this crazy things at once. It seems to me, and I'm at risk of committing heresy here, and I could be wrong, by the way, but it seems to me that at one point Trump had a more sane, during the campaign, more sane, at least campaign pitch about Syria than what he's doing now. I vaguely recall him saying, well, let's just get out of there. It's not our business. Is my memory wrong, or is that basically right?
I believe that is basically correct, but he has a lot of contradictory statements on that. But I think he initially had some arguments. So this is another quagmire. He famously said that the Iraq War was a total waste of money that didn't accomplish anything. But I think, reading between the lines of that rhetoric, I think it was pretty easy to tell that he is a person who would be very easily baited into doing some sort of intervention, as he ended up doing. And also, he surrounded himself with neoconservatives and other hawkish types. It's similar to his promise that he wasn't going to cut Medicaid.
Right.
It was like, well, he's a Republican, and he's going to staff his administration with Republicans. But it is true that rhetorically, at least, Trump somewhat tried to get to the left of Hillary Clinton, which was pretty easy because her rhetoric was so hawkish, especially on Russia too.
Yeah, it's interesting. One dimension of this, Ryan Cooper, is that if you know, I remember vividly during the election how the neoconservative policy elite, including a lot of people that were identified as Republicans, flocked to Clinton against Trump because they felt that Trump was a wild card, or for whatever reason, she would be a steady hand, sort of managing the national security system as they wanted it managed. But it seems to me that as soon as Trump got elected, they glommed on to him, and they're pretty much manipulating and guiding him now. Is that a fair assessment, you think?
I think, well, it's mostly fair. You know, I think he's kind of turned over war policy to, you know, people like James Mattis, you know, Secretary of Defense, and isn't really taking an active role. I know that a lot of the neocons, you know, like that Evan McMullen guy, are still glommed onto the resistance. You know, they sort of, I think, got a bit of momentum built up. David Frum, too, they got some momentum built up behind the idea that Trump's this anti-democratic, authoritarian person, and that even if he ends up getting the invasions going that they want, you know, war with Iran or whatever, he's still not, you know, not worth supporting. I think there's been a bit of a cleavage. I know that the protests have not become, have quieted down considerably since the election. They thought it would be more like a paleo-conservative and just pull all the troops out of everywhere and let them, you know, let the chips fall where they may. But, you know, he hasn't done that at all. It's like, well, I guess maybe he's not so bad.
Right. I mean, they've sort of co-opted him somehow into their worldview. All right. Well, in closing, let's just go back to so here we are where we could be escalating. A plane could get shot down. Tensions could rise. How do we prevent that from happening? Given that, as you say, you know, the chances may be low, but the penalties would be extraordinarily high. How do we prevent that?
You know, it's a very good question, and I think, you know, the number one thing that you could do would be for Senate Democrats or congressional Democrats broadly, rather, to assert their role as a necessary, you know, check on foreign policy. Like this whole Syrian intervention is, as far as I can tell, completely illegal. There was never any congressional authorization. You know, they claim it's covered by the 2001 authorization of military force, which is just completely preposterous. You know, we're fighting a sovereign state, you know, Assad's government, under the banner of this thing designed to fight the stateless terrorists in Afghanistan, like 1,000 miles away. It's just ludicrous. But Democrats have shown no appetite for that, to even really mention it. Instead, they're voting for sanctions on Russia almost universally. But if we were going to start, that's where I would start. And then after that, you know, just keep pressing this home, especially to the sort of resistance people who tend to flip out about Russia interfering with the election, which seemingly did happen. But, you know, just like in the Cold War, there's a limit to how far this fighting can go. And some of the rhetoric coming out of these folks is a little bit overheated. You know, there's no alternatives to diplomacy with Russia or any other nuclear armed power, really. And you have to remember that.
And I think we'll have to leave it there, but I think that's a great point. And Ryan Cooper, excellent piece in the week. Thanks for writing it. Thanks for coming on the show and talking about it.
Thanks for having me.